Thank you, Stefan. Also from me, a warm welcome to our public evening debate on the Commonsverse as a parallel polis with David Bollier as our main speaker and with Edmund Waldstein and Teresa Forcades Vila as commentators. As Stefan said, it is one of two public evening debates that form part of the workshop Beyond Liberalism, Commons, Constitutionalism, and the Common Good. And I would like to thank the Katholische Akademie and Stefan Steiner for hosting us here. In the workshop, we seek to explore what we perceive as a recent rediscovery of or turn to the common, the commons, or the common good as answers to a number of discontents with our current political order, with contemporary political economies, their implications in and contributions to a variety of interconnected crises and injustices. In this evening debate, we now want to address one variation of this turn to the common, which is the practice theory of commoning. In tomorrow's debate, we then focus on a different variation, namely common good constitutionalism, which will be introduced by Adrien Vermeulen, with comments from Corinne Peluchon and Joseph Weiler. And I'd like to invite you already now to come back and also attend tomorrow's public debate, as I'm confident that these two debates, if received side by side, will offer much food for thought and prompt fruitful conversation on overlaps and divergences between these both two approaches to the common. But now let's turn to the topic of this evening, the Commonsverse, and tonight's speakers. I'm very delighted to introduce to you David Bollier. David is an important thinker, independent scholar and activist, well known to everyone interested in the commons and commoning. To mention just two of his most recent publications, I would like to refer you to the Commoners Catalogue for Change-Making from 2021, with plenty of examples of past and present experiments in commoning, such as food cooperatives, solar commons projects, and community land trusts. It not only vividly illustrates and explains what commoning is and may be, it also provides tools for people who want to engage in commoning themselves. The other publication I wish to mention is the book David wrote together with Silke Helfrich, Free, Fair and Alive, was published 2019 simultaneously in German and in English, and is available open access in German via transcript. In his obituary for Silke Helfrich, who died in 2021, David writes, amongst other things, about their shared enthusiasm for the international subculture of commoners as, and I quote, a rich zone of underexplored promise. He describes their endeavor of reinventing, theorizing, and disseminating knowledge about commons as learning to become, and I quote again, participant anthropologists, activists, strategists, allies, networkers, popularizers for all things related to the commons, quote end. In addition to all of this, David currently is director of the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics in Massachusetts. As commoning is primarily a collective practice, we thought it apt to invite two commentators who, whilst, like David, being thinkers and writers, are also practitioners with intimate knowledge of communal life. The first comment on David's lecture will be given by Edmund Waldstein. Pater Edmund is a monk of the Cistercian Abbey of Heiligenkreuz in Austria. He is a doctor of theology and also a writer. He does research and writes inter alia on the common good, Catholic social teaching, integralism, and the theology and philosophy of nature. Edmund Waldstein runs his own blog where you find shorter and thought-provoking texts of his, which I recommend taking a look at. Edmund also teaches. He's a lecturer in moral theology at the Hochschule Heiligenkreuz, close to Vienna in Austria. The comment by Pater Edmund will be immediately followed by a comment from Teresa Forcades. Teresa is a physician, theologian, and Benedictine nun in the mountain monastery of Saint Benet de Montserrat in Catalonia, Spain. She's both a doctor in medicine and in sacred theology. Her English book, Faith and Freedom, gives insights not only into her activism for Catalan independence and social justice, as well as her understanding of feminism, but also her life as a Benedictine nun. Teresa is the director of the Syncletica monastic school, according to its self-description, a school that is open to all, located in a monastery but non-confessional in scope, where all are welcome and courses are aimed at deepening our common humanity. I very much look forward to our debate and would like to invite David now to take the floor.
Thank you so much. It is such a treat to be back in Berlin, which I regard something of a second or sometimes first home for my work on the Commons. I spent many of my formative years, say, let's call it 2008 through 15, working with a number of German colleagues and the Heinrich Böll Foundation. I had a stint at the American Academy in Berlin. And so I find this such a welcoming environment for these kinds of discussions, and I'm thrilled that we're having this kind of a discussion here. I was particularly attracted by the title of this workshop, which wants to explore the intersection of commons, constitutionalism, and the common good, and how it might point to territories beyond liberalism, which is the title of this workshop. I think this is a necessary, timely dialogue because so many of the certitudes of the political economy and culture are slowly crumbling before our eyes right now. And it's fair to say that so many grand narratives of our time about citizenship, freedom, property rights, economic growth, theories of value have been called into question. And existing institutions and categories of thought just aren't working so well right now. On the one hand, few people really want to open to talk about structural change and the necessary alternatives, lest it open a Pandora's box of monsters and chaos. And on the other hand, as we move more deeply into the danger zones of climate change, authoritarian nationalism, savage inequality and precarity, institutional breakdown, we really have little choice. We need to abandon some settled habits. We need desperately to find a new North Star, or perhaps North Stars, in a more stable, a wholesome social order. Today, I'd like to introduce the idea of commons to you and suggest its enormous potential for reimagining so many things: the capitalist political economy, state power, our social relations and hierarchies, our relations with the earth, our inner lives. To be sure, this is a daunting proposition and a long-term project. We not only have to develop some very different social logics and institutional forms while remaining entrenched in a problematic system, we also have to change ourselves. And we have to find ways to overcome the traumas of capitalism, colonialism, and centralized state power, whose norms most of us have internalized or repressed. So in my remarks, I'd like to suggest that commons and commoning can provide us with the scaffolding to reinvent a vision for the common good. It can help us develop more humane social practices and ethical behaviors at the cellular level, which, as they expand, can help us move beyond a world of capital accumulation, consumerism, and progress through growth. Now, to be sure, most commons today are dismissed as too small scale, local, and cash poor to be significant. To the mainstream, they appear to be archaic oddities. Respectable opinion assumes that really only the market and state are the only serious regimes for getting something done. There's the private sector and there's the public sector, and not much else really matters, really, according to established opinion. Yet I think this is a specious debate, or at least a very narrow framing of our problems. Market and state both celebrate economic growth and are deeply allied, if with different roles, in promoting a liberal political and economic order. The state wants unfettered markets to generate growth, tax revenues, and social mobility for citizens, while corporations and investors want the state to provide stable governance, legal privileges and subsidies for businesses, and the cleanup after financial crashes, ecological catastrophes, market abuses, and so many other market externalities, so-called. Despite divergent priorities, state and market are utterly symbiotic, enough that it makes sense to talk about the market-state system. And it is this regime to which the Commons offers an alternative vision. Politicians and economists may dismiss the Commons with a wave of a hand, as they do, but I think commoners understand a deeper truth, that the presumptions of capitalist modernity are profoundly flawed, if not already collapsing. The 2000 financial meltdown revealed the arrogant power of global finance and capitalism, even as its deficiencies became more apparent. We see and all of this, I might add, with the complicity of the liberal state in perpetuating these abuses. The arrival of Brexit, the COVID pandemic, austerity politics, Donald Trump, reactionary nationalism, the racial and ethnic othering of people have only intensified the sense of fear and insecurity. And I haven't even mentioned the brutal realities of climate change, floods, droughts, wildfires, extreme weather, which are exposing economic growth as a utopian fantasy. Its extractivism and reliance on carbon energy sources cannot continue, nor can the drive to impose capitalist development, so-called, on the world, as so many non-white people around the world, victims of colonialism and coercive capitalist development, demand reparations, ecological restoration, and climate justice. Now, new politicians or policies or laws are not going to solve these problems because the problems are basically structural in nature. The market state does not have the affordances to overcome them any more than a bicycle could take us to the moon. You might say that we're trapped in an interregnum, in the famous line that the old order has not passed away yet, but the new order is not ready to be born. So I often ask myself, what is to be done? And I have drawn inspiration from and guidance from Václav Havel, the Czech playwright. When he and other cultural dissidents in the 1970s faced a totalizing repressive system, in his case, the Czech government, Havel's response was to develop what he called a parallel polis. A parallel polis is a community-created safe space in which people mutually support each other, directly produce what they need, and build a kind of shadow society. The idea of a parallel polis serves many purposes. People can have a space to debunk official propaganda and expand their imaginations of what's possible. They can build horizontal, convivial relationships with one another while creating a prefigurative new order. They can speak the truth and express wholesome values. They can reclaim their dignity, social solidarity, and hope. I see the Commonsverse as a kind of parallel polis. And by Commonsverse, I mean the countless projects, organizations, and social movements that are committed to commoning as a way to bring about system change. 2 years ago, as Isabel mentioned, I published the Commoners Catalog for Changemaking to showcase the enormous diversity of commons that are already here. It's no utopian project. And I'd like to give a quick overview of some of the more notable theaters of action, you might say, in the Commonsverse to give you some concrete reference points. Let's start with land as a commons. Decommodifying land is an important way to make land accessible and affordable for local housing, local farming, housing, and conservation especially. One important tool in this regard is community land trust, which takes land off the markets to make it a commons in perpetuity. Land trusts help preserve the landscape, reduce wealth inequality, and make it more affordable to grow nutritious food locally. Peer-directed projects of co-housing, housing cooperatives, or federations of such housing, such as the German Mietshauer Syndikat, can provide social housing alongside initiatives by state or local communities. Another set of commons, is local food sovereignty, especially in North America and Europe, where there are many movements to reinvent local agriculture and food supply chains. Organic local farming started this trend about 50 years ago, And it's now seen quite robustly in permaculture, agroecology, the slow food movement, and even a slow fish movement trying to protect coastal fisheries. Food cooperatives are a time-proven model for bringing farmers and consumers more closely together into mutually supportive relationships, helping to lower prices, assure more stable local food supplies, and generate or use more eco-friendly agricultural practices. The city as a commons is a flourishing field. People in Barcelona, Amsterdam, Seoul, Korea, Bologna, and dozens of other major and minor cities or smaller cities are experimenting with new forms of collaborative governance. A number of commons public partnerships, so-called, are creating maker spaces, systems of urban agriculture, civic information commons, and neighborhood improvements and services. These are ways to empower citizens, re-knit the social fabric, and reclaim popular control of cities from wealthy developers and absentee investors. There's also lots of independent commons projects in cities, such as community gardens, energy production commons, and even a regional Wi-Fi system in Catalonia, Wi-Fi-net, which rivals anything you can get from commercial vendors. Traditional indigenous peoples are, of course, you might say the original commoners. There's an estimated 2 billion people around the world who depend on commons for their everyday subsistence through the stewardships of forest, fisheries, farmlands, pastures, water, and wild game. Economists don't tend to find this so interesting, however, because there's no markets or money changing hands necessarily, except on the margins. But the commoning performed by traditional communities and indigenous peoples are demonstrating that locally grounded, eco-friendly alternatives to industrial agriculture are here already. Some 70% of the world's biodiversity exists on lands managed by indigenous peoples. Alternative currencies. Many communities around the world have created their own regional and local currencies, and the idea is to capture the financial value locally instead of letting it be siphoned away by the big financial centers, so that it can stimulate local markets, jobs creation, and cultural identity. In Western Massachusetts, where I come from, the Berkshire's currency has become the most successful alternative currency in the United States. But there's also even, you might say, non-money type of currencies like time banking, which is a service barter system that lets the elderly and people without much money meet their needs through a credit exchange system. The open source software revolution is familiar to many or most of you. It's over the past 25 years, it's become a powerful symbol of what commoning can produce, producing, for example, Linux, as represented by the penguin logo, which rivals anything produced by proprietary software vendors. But free and open source software has also created vital infrastructure for the internet that functions to this day, Wikipedia, many world-class software systems for group deliberation, group budgeting, cloud storage of files, and much else. Again, an example of great empowerment. Cosmo-local production is going yet another step beyond this. It's an offshoot of open source production, which consists of the sharing of design and knowledge on a global scale, but the production of physical things locally. You have the production of motor vehicles, electronics, farm equipment through groups like FarmHack and Open Source Ecology. There's even a global commons of diabetics that have produced an automatic insulin delivery system device that's cheaper and more versatile than that produced by the commercial medical establishment. So an example of what the kinds of innovation that can occur, I might add that reducing the global supply chains to produce things has obvious implications for climate change and carbon emissions. Creative Commons licenses. They were introduced about 20 years ago, and they made it possible to legally share writing, images, music, all sorts of different type of creative genres without permission or payment. And these are free, public voluntary licenses that copyright holders can use to signal in advance to the world that this work is shareable, reusable, modifiable under specified terms. There's about 6 different major licenses. These are currently used in more than 170 legal jurisdictions around the world and have been hugely important in allowing the legal sharing of content, which is otherwise strictly controlled by the copyright industries. Now, what's notable about in each of these commons is they draw on the particularities of their context. They're not a universal system. And I've been astonished to discover commons dedicated to such things as non-commercial theater, to super high-quality scientific microscopes using open source technology, to online maps to aid humanitarian rescue, to providing hospitality for refugees and migrants. And in each case, people are bringing their own distinctive talents, geographies, histories, traditions, provisioning traditions, values, and intersubjectivities to meet needs without capitalist markets or bureaucratic direction. So, when seen from the inside, and I think this is important, each commons is not only unique, it's an exercise in world making. It's an intersubjective set of feelings, experiences, values, and perspectives. And the reality of our intersubjective experiences forces us to acknowledge that the world is better understood as a robust pluriverse and not a fixed monoculture as the type pursued by neoliberal modern capitalism. But if, where was I here? But if each commons is unique, how does one begin to make generalizations about them? I mean, I think at a minimum, we can say that a commons arises when a given community stewards some type of shared wealth collectively with an accent on fair access, use, and long-term sustainability. But that doesn't really explain the regularities among very different commons in very different contexts. My late colleague Silke Helfrich and I came to realize that this problem is an epistemological and ontological problem. Our prevailing modern worldview cannot understand commons properly. It's simply too reductionist, too materialistic, too economistic in its perspective. It tends to be focused on individuals, a la Prisoner's Dilemma, and not the whole system. Our worldview misrepresents commoners as economic individuals, rational, self-sovereign, dedicated to maximizing their material self-interest, and it doesn't understand, it tries to portray that they're just these rational individuals pursuing cooperation, strangely, instead of through the markets. But I can attest through my own, you might say, amateur ethnographic studies of commons around the world, that if we're to understand commoning on its own social and ethical terms, and in the context of evolutionary history and biology, we must recognize that commons are deeply relational and social, which is why I prefer the word commoning, the verb, to commons, the noun. Because commons are not simply resources, as economists like to see them, they are living social organisms. The latest biological research shows how profoundly interconnected and interdependent plants and trees and fungi all are, and of course how we are, and how even at the cellular level, life is deeply symbiotic, as the pioneering biologist Lynn Margulis showed. So too with commoners. We live in relationship with each other, and with the earth, and with the more than human life, and with the past and the future generations. A commons is animated by the full emotional, ethical, and spiritual agency of people, not just their calculative rationality. Silke and I came to realize that commoning is in fact a dynamic aliveness, that is created and sustained through social and ecological relationships. I like this quote by Thomas Berry. cultural historian, who said that the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And also a similar or other quote by the biologist and eco-philosopher Andreas Weber, who's a Berlin resident and a friend and colleague of mine. He says that science and economics are unwilling to acknowledge creative aliveness as an ontological foundation of reality. So both of these, I think, start to get to the core of what we need to think about. In Free, Fair, and Alive, Silke and I set out to explain how aliveness in commons actually works. We wanted to answer questions like, if it's all about relationality, how exactly do diverse personalities and priorities get aligned into coherent commons? How do important things get made and care provided without the exchange of money? How do peer-driven systems of cooperation come into being and sustain themselves? Fortunately, we were able to stand on the shoulders of Professor Elinor Ostrom and her pioneering design principles of successful commons. She won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her life's work of both field work and creative theorizing about the elements that make for a successful commons. And she identified the need for clearly defined boundaries, for example, and self-created rules of governance. She discovered how commoners have to be able to participate in making the rules, and they must participate in monitoring how the rules are enforced. If there are disputes, a commons has to have its own low-cost, rapid system for resolving them. And commons have to have independence from state authorities. And yet, this traditional thinking about the commons remains largely within the standard economic framework and its methodological individualism. It doesn't give much attention to the inner lives of commoners or to the political economy. So Silke and I developed a relational framing that helps us see more clearly and deeply how commons actually work. We found guidance in the work of Christopher Alexander, who is he died just a couple of years ago. He was a dissident urban planner and architect who had developed the idea of pattern languages. And he had observed that in his field, and many other fields actually, certain solutions to recurrent problems tend to recur again and again with minor variations across the grand sweep of history and culture. And he called these solutions patterns. And they're designs and behaviors that emerge from social practice. Their effectiveness is ratified by the repeated use, but in each case, the patterns bear the imprint of their distinctive context. So there's a way to both acknowledge the context and point to generalities that are there. So applying the pattern language methodology, Silke and I identified several dozen relational patterns in the many, many commons we had witnessed over 15 years. We grouped the three patterns, or the patterns into three spheres, what we called social life, peer governance, and provisioning, which can be roughly understood as the social, the institutional, and the economic. And together, these three spheres constitute what we call the triad of commoning. And the triad helps us answer the question, what social practices and ethical behaviors help create and maintain successful relationships of commoning? I can't go through the whole 25-plus patterns we found, but I do want to give you a quick sense of the patterns. So, for example, in the social life of commoning, one important pattern is cultivate shared purpose and values. And without this practice, a commons falls apart. People need to share experiences and collectively reflect on their commoning if they're going to remain a coherent, vital group. A related pattern is ritualized togetherness. People have to be able to meet each other, share with each other, celebrate their accomplishments and affinities as a group. It's also important to play together, to organize rituals and traditions and festivities. The social life of a commons also requires that people freely contribute. They have to give without the expectation that they'll directly or immediately get a return, but of course, commons do deliver real benefits over time to people. Peer governance, another of the spheres, is all about seeing other people as equals and sharing the rights and duties of collective decision-making. With peer governance, You try to avoid hierarchies and centralized systems of powers because they tend to be a setup for the abuse of power and accountability problems. So you want distributed power. And peer governance requires, among other things, in pursuance of that goal, sharing knowledge generously among the members of the group. This is an indispensable way to develop collective wisdom. Knowledge grows when it's shared, but this can only happen if information is accessible and freely circulating. A related pattern here is honoring transparency in the sphere of trust, not just the typical liberal disclosure of transparency, but in a sphere of trust so that you can share embarrassing or difficult information without you suffering or being attacked for it. Finally, a third sphere is provisioning, and this is about how consumers produce what they need. There is no separation of production and consumption as there is in the market economy, because the basic goal is to integrate one's economic needs with the rest of one's personal life. Commoners don't produce to sell in the marketplace. Indeed, they have to take care how to structure their interactions with markets, if they interact with markets at all, in order to protect the integrity of their commons community. One basic pattern of provisioning is make and use together. Anyone who wants to take responsibilities can participate can join. Everyone contributes according to their own capacities, talents, and needs. Co-producing is what you might call do it together, or DIT. There are many other effective patterns that we describe here that show how provisioning generally gets done reliably and effectively in a commons. So once you begin to get into these patterns of commenting, you start to see how relationality is the fundamental reality of life. And you begin to embrace a different worldview, or what I call an ontological shift or onto shift. And this takes some training and practice. It's not something you can just read about and do. You have to experience. And I don't want to get into the philosophical dimensions of this right now. We might perhaps in the workshop a bit. But let's just say that shifting one's worldview begins with adopting new social practices and experiences of commoning, which in time change our inner life and perspectives. We begin to leave behind the selfish individualism and transactional mindset of market culture, and we start to see the world as an integrated whole driven by a dense web of symbiotic cooperative relationships. In a Commonsverse, the common good is not some fixed idealization or elusive endpoint. It's a dynamic aliveness that manifests as a cooperative ethic expands and emerges horizontally and from below. It manifests as an organic connection and wholeness, which in truth is both a biological and spiritual imperative of living organisms. It manifests in our inner lives as a sense of security, fairness, and belonging forged through caring relationships. It manifests as systemic diversity and resilience. And in all of this, I was reminded of Pope Francis's Laudato Si vision of the common good, which accents many similar points about the interconnections of our spiritual lives, the more than human world, and our commonwealth, and our destiny as a species. But at this point, we stand at a threshold and things start to get very complicated in interesting ways. As commons and commoning have proliferated over the years, they've increasingly come into conflict with the powers of the state, capitalist enterprise, and neoliberalism. The market state is aggressively committed to its own priorities and vision, which may or may not accommodate the commons. I'm sorry, I forgot the slide, but commons as an onto shift perspective. History has shown that the growth economy usually attempts to appropriate and privatize common assets and dispossess commoners, as seen in the English enclosure movements, the centuries of colonial conquest, and today capitalist development that seeks to propertize and monetize anything of value, from artificial nanomatter and genes to mathematical algorithms and flows of water packaged as financial securities and so much else. So an urgent question for commoners is how they can use the law to stop enclosures of their shared wealth and to protect their commoning. Is this actually possible? And so a question that I ask is, can the liberal constitutional order affirmatively protect commoning while respecting its integrity as a non-capitalist social form? Does it want to? Is it possible to artfully blend the vernacular law of the commons and Western jurisprudence, if only as a makeshift détente? Or are the philosophical commitments of liberalism too rigid, too aggressive, too politically entrenched to support the commons and the living value that it generates? Let's be clear, the commons embodies a very different theory of value than market price, which in our times is considered the default universal metric of value, price and value. The commons instead recognizes that living systems are generative and that value is not and cannot be generally propertized, monetized, and commercially traded. At least that there's a presumption against that because it tends to enclose that generative value system. By contrast, the market state system reflexively objectifies life through property law, contract law, intellectual property law, commercial law, and state power, for its part, welcomes the opportunity to consolidate its power through its alliances with capital. It generally wants to centralize and regularize the administrative control of people, nature, and other living systems. And as political scientist James Scott has made clear, the modern state attempts with varying success to create a terrain and a population with precisely those standardized characteristics that will be easiest to monitor, count, assess, and manage. He continues, the utopian, imminent, and continually frustrated goal of the modern state is to reduce the chaotic, disorderly, constantly changing social reality beneath it to something more closely resembling the administrative grid of its observation. Now that states are armed with digital surveillance technologies and partnerships with big tech, the logical endpoint of this trend is unavoidably an authoritarian one. It's unclear how far state law and liberalism will bend in this direction, but that too is an open question in the future. But it helps to remember that liberalism is deeply yoked to state power and disinclined to recognize the role of customary practice or collective identities of commoners. Like markets, the liberal state is deeply committed to individualism, property rights, contract freedom, and material progress. And this encourages an ethic of separation of humans from each other, of humans from the earth, and of humans from historical memory and the future. As the law scholar Sergei Gutwerth has put it, the liberal state does not have the means to, quote, attribute rights to dynamic collectives without legal personalities. It does this, of course, for corporations, but their missions of growth are much more congenial to the state. Some 800 years ago, many specific rights of commoners were actually honored in law through the landmark Charter of the Forest, which was a companion document to the Magna Carta. But the Charter of the Forest has been largely forgotten, and with the rise of the nation state and even liberalism, legal recognition for commoning, for people's right of access to the things essential to their survival, has remained elusive. What this suggests to me is that liberalism as currently practiced is philosophically indifferent or hostile to the commons, or at least to the commons understood as social systems, or at least ignorant of its actual value and dynamics. Because the state is eager to and vigilant to assert the legality of its exercises of power as formally enacted through its law and procedures and state institutions, but it only has passing regard for the social and ethical legitimacy claimed by commons-based regimes. So power preserves itself by upholding its chosen epistemic regime. When discussing liberalism and commoning, we therefore encounter a rift between legality and legitimacy. The market state order invokes formal jurisprudence and bureaucracy to affirm the legality of its administrative order. It has far less interest in the dynamic governance and vernacular practices and experiences of commoners who have their own epistemic order, their own vision of law and legitimacy that deserves to be heard. So I consider this the territory that our Beyond Liberalism workshop should explore. The gap between legality of state legality and commons legitimacy is a space of great vulnerability, danger, and possibility. There are some impressive innovations that have attempted to bridge this space and some fascinating experiments to develop working hybrids. I want to just mention 3 of them before concluding. The bridging the gap, the 3 of them are the use of legal hacks to create new social norms and practices, the development of new organizational forms that support commoning, and commons public partnerships that bring commoners and state officials into collaboration, usually at the municipal level, at least at this stage. And legal hacks are creative adaptations of state law in ways not originally imagined or intended by lawmakers. And the point of legal hacks is to carve out new zones of legality from within existing law and then to fill those zones with new social norms and political action. The point is to leverage popular legitimacy and community practice to establish a new legality, you might say. And legal hacks can decriminalize commoning that has been declared illegal by the state. For example, seed sharing, code sharing, humanitarian rescue, or create protected legal spaces for commoning to flourish. And prime examples of this include the Creative Commons licenses that are essentially a hack on copyright law by making creative works legally shareable. The various so-called rights to nature laws are similarly legal hacks, attempting to give legal personality to rivers, mountains, and landscapes as ways to protect them. Because the prevailing framework of law authorizing corporations, cooperatives, and nonprofits fails to recognize how commoning works, it's often necessary to create new organizational forms, sometimes with legal hacks there, at least in Western nations. Some legal advocates like the Sustainable Economies Law Center and the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights in the US are developing innovative bylaws and financial structures to design decentralized organizations that can grow from the grassroots. They also seek to create self-managed staff collectives managed as commons and plots of so-called self-owning land that have legal personhood. Finally, on the bottom you can see actual and proposed commons public partnerships, as mentioned earlier, are popping up in many cities. The point here is to develop new types of flexible, non-bureaucratic collaboration between municipal bureaucracies and commoners. These frequently involve elder care, child care, neighborhood improvements, stewardship of public spaces and buildings, commons for digital information, open source technologies for civic uses, and so on. It remains an open question how well this open source participation can be blended with the bureaucratic mindset and the tendency of politicians wanting to claim all credit for themselves. But as I hope my remarks make clear, the idea of the common good is, in our world of liberal constitutionalism, is very much up for grabs. It's not entirely clear how it should be defined and understood, what social relationships are needed to generate it, what sorts of political institutions and processes, including law, are needed to protect it, and how state power may need to be reimagined or reinvented. But perhaps the most pivotal issue is what implicit vision of human flourishing in spiritual life lies behind a given vision of the common good. Now, I obviously like to think that the Commons and Commoning has a lot to contribute to this discussion by critiquing both the limits of capitalist modernity and by exploring post-capitalist and exploring pre-modern as well as post-capitalist and contemporary traditions of organized cooperation and sharing. But I am very eager to hear some other perspectives in the coming days and the coming days of the workshop and in the discussion we're about to have. So thank you for listening.
So for one other perspective, I would like to invite Pater Edmund to give his comment.
Thank you so much, David, for that very rich and thought-provoking paper. And my thanks also to the organizers of the conference for this invitation. I was particularly pleased by the picture that's on the flyer of our conference. It's a map of the Cistercian Abbey of Neitzel, which is in Lower Lusatia, not far from here, an abbey of my order. And I thought maybe I'll talk a little bit about this Abbey of Neitzel as a way of bringing up some of the questions that your talk aroused in me, as it were. Questions about the relation of sort of bottom-up projects of commoning that you were talking about and efforts by political authorities to promote the common good. And I thought the question you raised right at the end about the implicit vision of human flourishing that lies behind a given vision of the common good is particularly important. So let me talk a little bit about Neitzel, which you see here on the poster and also on the flyer. The Abbey of Neitzel began in 1268 when Margrave Henry the Illustrious, Margrave of Meissen and of Lusatia, donated lands in Lower Lusatia to monks from a Cistercian abbey in Bohemia. At the time, the Cistercians were more than a century old, and they had, for more than a century, been really a dynamic force for commoning in many of the senses in which you discussed it. At the center of the Cistercian life is the spiritual good, ultimately God himself, who is seen as the ultimate common good, the end, the common end towards which all the monks are striving. A good which is not diminished and not divided by being shared. And this is what scholastic theologians at the time of the foundation of Neitzel had started to call an extrinsic common good, because it's a good that's beyond the community that's seeking it. Around that central extrinsic common good, the Cistercians built an orderly life of prayer, work, study, eating and sleeping, which was ordered according to the rule of St. Benedict, which has already been referred to during our conference. And this order of life can be seen as the intrinsic common good, intrinsic in the sense that it's the good that constitutes this community. And here too, we see that it's a good that's not diminished by being shared, nor is it divided by being shared. Each of the monks participates in this good of the common order of their life without thereby diminishing the share of the others. This order includes some elements that would appear egalitarian to us, including of course, famously holding all possessions in common. So the rule of St. Benedict is very strict against private property. None of the monks are allowed to have anything of their own, but they receive everything they need from the abbot, who distributes the goods which belong to the community. But this order also includes elements which we would see as more hierarchical. The rule of St. Benedict presupposes that the true good of the monks and the true good of human beings, more generally you could say, cannot be attained without discipline, without rules and authorities which help the monks to overcome bad habits and disordered desires and be liberated through true virtue. The community was what the scholastics called a prudential society, meaning it's ordered to the living of a fulfilled human life rather than to some particular product of human activity or technology, of human art, as they called it. Nevertheless, as part of the order of their life, they also produced, and do to this day. The monks of Neitzel in the 13th century cleared forests, they drained marshes, they worked and developed the land and founded villages in which other people could live, not members of the monastic community. Now, what was the intention of Henry the Illustrious in donating land to the Cistercians for the foundation of Neitzel? Certainly, one intention was the development of Christianity here in the far north. The Austrians think this place is inhabited by wild pagans. He was concerned for the spiritual good of his subjects, but he was also interested in the cultural, agricultural, and economic development of the region. The new agricultural methods and technologies that had been developed by the Cistercians, including innovative uses of water wheels, for which the Cistercians were famous, could play an important role in the development of the lands, which at that time were a little better than a wilderness. In other words, he hoped that it would contribute to the flourishing of his people on many different levels. And he was not disappointed. Neitzel developed the area, developed a kind of feudal domain that and established about 30 villages in the area. Can we see such a Cistercian abbey as a parallel polis, to use the Václav Havel term? In a way, yes, and in a way, no. Parallel suggests that the distance remains the same between the two polis, the two cities, but we see here also convergences. We see influences, as I just enumerated, in the ways in which the Cistercians were thought by the rulers of the time to be beneficial to the development of the area. And we also see more properly political influences from the Cistercians to sort of medieval constitutional law, usually indirectly. That is, the Cistercians influenced other religious orders such as the Norbertines and the Dominicans, who then influenced constitutional law, especially the Dominicans. Obviously, there were parts of the structure of monastic community that they did not attempt to carry over into the structure of civil society, right? So common property, for example, was not attempted at that time at a large scale. Later in so-called really existing socialism, we have some attempts at this. But what you do have is, for example, the Charter of Charity, which was the document written by St. Stephen Harding, a Cistercian abbot, that structured the relation of different Cistercian abbeys among each other. This was influential on the structure of the Dominican order, which was then influential on political structures, including on the Magna Carta in the Kingdom of England, which you mentioned. Now, the cooperation between the Cistercians and Margrave Henry the Illustrious was clearly based on a shared vision of human flourishing and spiritual life, which lay behind their vision of the common good. But in subsequent centuries, the monks of Neitzel could not always rely on a shared vision with temporal rulers. In the Hussite Wars, 12 of the monks of Neitzel were killed by the Hussites because they didn't share the same spiritual vision. After the Reformation, the population around Neitzel became Protestant, and Neitzel became sort of a Catholic island in a Protestant sea. Its continued existence was assured by various treaties, but it was always kind of precarious. And the new monks, had to be recruited for the monastery from further afield. Most of the monks of Neitzel after the Reformation came from Bohemia, from the modern-day Czech Republic. And it was during this period that the map on our flyer was made, which shows the elaborate Baroque remodeling of the monastery's lands, a very different aesthetic from what was customary in the surrounding area, a sign of contradiction, as it were. After the Napoleonic Wars, Neitzel came under Prussian dominion, and in the year 1817, the abbey was dissolved by King Frederick William III of Prussia, its lands being confiscated by the Prussian state. Based obviously on the Prussian state's different idea of what human flourishing consists in, they saw the monastery as a relic of a bygone and backward age that had to be got rid of. And the buildings and some of its lands are now administered by a state foundation. In 2018, however, 6 monks from my own community in Austria, from Stift Heiligenkreuz, came to Neitzel and refounded the monastery there, as it were. The Cistercian life is once again beginning there. And this new foundation of Neitzel would not have been possible without the cooperation of the government of the land of Brandenburg, in which we are today. And at the time, Brandenburg was governed by a so-called red-red coalition, that is, a coalition between the Social Democrats and the left, Die Linke, which is both of those are left parties, but one even more left than the other. And in particularly the culture minister, the Social Democrat Martina Münch, who supported the project against the objections of various interested parties, especially within the state-run foundation that owns the buildings. Now, why did she support this project? Presumably, she didn't expect us to found another 30 villages, as the Cistercians did in the 13th century. But it seems that she really saw some cultural and even spiritual value in some part of the monastery being used for its original purpose. Clearly, the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party to which she belongs, does not in every respect share the vision of human flourishing that we as Cistercians have. The SPD is clearly committed in many ways to the liberal order, the state market structure that you were mentioning. Nevertheless, a certain amount of cooperation is possible, and who knows what the future will hold. At any rate, I think that efforts for the common good require movements in 2 directions. We need both spontaneous projects of commoning, like the ones you were describing, that come, as it were, from below. And we also need politicians and statesmen who, as it were, from the top down, are willing to make room for such projects and who are willing to take political action for the sake of the common good. The more a true understanding of human flourishing can be promoted at both levels, at all levels, the more cooperation will be possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pater Edmund. And now we hear the comment by Teresa Forcades.
Thank you. I thought more of my intervention more than a different take on it from giving an example is more like a dialogue with what has been presented in the first conference. And in that sense, I would like to say, because I'll raise some critical points, but I want to start by saying that as myself being a Trinitarian theologian, nothing can be closer to my heart than the being as relationality, right? So that being as communion, that is what we think in theology. And being as communion means for me not only that human beings are called to live together, but it means that a stone is because it's being loved. Because the love of God is sustaining the stone and the rain, the drop of water, and everything that exists. It doesn't exist because some kind of ontology of the substance, but it exists because of an ontology of relationality, if that makes sense. And that was already a challenge to Aristotelian philosophy at the beginning of the Christianity. So this, I cannot be closer to that, and even not only theoretically, but in a month I'm going to be living with the Amish. So it's also practically that I am trying to learn from people that have different projects. So this is from that commonality, let's say, that I raise some critical points or for our common discussion. So, and the critical points would be by reading, because the responders, we had the chance to read the paper before and now listening to you again. This, when you spoke about market and you spoke about the state and even the state market system, right? I was a bit confused there because I was expecting maybe that you presented an alternative to that, but it's not exactly an alternative as I have seen it, because if it were, then what would be looking at is an alternative to state, meaning that we can dispose of the state. Now, Edmund was saying, no, we need to cooperate and we need rulers like that share our vision, or at least have a strategic or maybe spiritual, right, desire to help. But then it raises questions for me, because I think in our age we are having what? We are having an increase, I have mentioned before, this privatization of public health, right, in the places that we had it before. I don't see that diminishing. I don't deny that what you say is that the commoning or the commons are flourishing or are increasing. I take that as face value. But at the same time that the privatization is getting not only worse, much worse, in the sense that, for example, the human genome, and you have mentioned that, right? It's already in 30% or 25% privatized, in the sense that when I studied medicine, I could access articles from all kinds of journals because that was supposed to be an open thing. Now, if you don't have a subscription, you cannot even write a paper because you cannot access to what's being published. And even universities and libraries, they need to just pay a subscription for each individual journal, which many of them can also not do. So it's another area where I think it's very problematic. And even more subtle areas, I was astonished a few years ago. I gave a course on bioethics, and when I spoke about euthanasia, I did the research, and I still was with this naive idea that people who request euthanasia or people who agree to laws that accept euthanasia was because of trying to avoid the extreme pain or degradation that a human life can experience when there is nothing medically possible to be done and the pain just gets worse and this type of dramatic situation. But it was not the answer. The answer was most people agreed to euthanasia for themselves or at the state law because of loss of autonomy, right? It means that a life that is dependent on others, it's not worthwhile to live. And this I see extending. This I don't see diminishing. I was, as I say, astonished that people who come to my teaching at the monastery for 10 years, they were all like thinking, if you'll have independence, I was thinking all my sisters who are above 95, and they are so happily so because they are well taken care of, right? And they don't want to die, and they are enjoying life, and not only enjoying it, they are making me enjoy life. They are giving me so much, and some of them are 100, and 3 died at 100, and one is 103. So this, but in general, people even very close to what can be my own teaching, or they were like, above 75, and I've heard that in Holland they are discussing at least, and maybe some of you know better, a law that says euthanasia, if you are above 75, only for that reason you can ask for it. It's sufficient because it's like you've already done enough in your life and maybe you are facing dependency. So this horror of dependency, I just raise it as a question. I don't have an answer, but what's going on, right? That's like the most horrible phantom, and at the same time we speak of some kind of raising. So I'm coming to the point that the critical point would be, are the commons or commoning, not in its deep a flourishing image or in its deep understanding of humanity and living together, but in the practice of nowadays, is that like the little cherry on the cake or something, like decoration for something that really is going in the other direction completely? And so a distraction. You understand how I raised it, right? With all goodwill to make it advance, but a distraction in the sense that, do we need something else? And then I was struck when you quoted Václav Havel, because you said, Václav Havel, the playwright. Well, it's true, but he was the statesman. He was the president of his country for 10 years, right, at least? So it's, again, this almost, I could see, confrontation between state, evil. You then say it like this, but I'm making a bit state evil, market evil, and then something that maybe it's coming to be the real thing, right? Where we can realize our full humanity, and that we call the commons or commoning. But Václav Havel was, thanks be to God, was a statesman because he could achieve so much by being so, right? So what my question would be, what is the notion of what kind of a state can we envision? Because my own thinking is, state is not evil. I wanted my own state, Catalonia, and our own state. No, it's true. This fighting for independence, I mean, not my own private, but but what it means. Why did I want that? Of course, I was thinking about that in these 3 years of political activism, and I never wanted an autarky. So when Benedict says it's better that the monks don't go out, well, we are here now, right? But even Benedict in the 6th century says, better that the monks don't go out of the monastery. Next chapter, what to do when the monk goes out of the monastery? So they were going out from the beginning, right? So we know that it is not possible, but I don't think it's desirable, right? To make islands as any kind of autarky, it would go against this interdependency. That would be my main challenge, which is, as I understand being as communion, I understand it especially as communion between the different ones, right? Rosa Luxemburg, the freedom is freedom of the one who thinks differently. So how do I come in communion with those with whom I would never have chosen to go in communion? That's the challenge in Barcelona. I don't know, in Berlin it's a bit different, but in Barcelona most people live in apartment buildings and they have to just come together. All the people in the apartment building that don't like each other, they vote completely different. They would have never chosen, but it's like, okay, the meeting of the community, because they have to solve common issues. They don't have a very good press, these meetings. It's not an enjoyable experience, but somehow I feel that's where we need to start. Not in some kind of, which I don't mean to exclude that, right? But this potential of group of people who think more or less alike and come together because they are inspired by the same vision, I like that. I live in a Benedictine community, and of course we share so much. But what about this, I would say, real political community, which it's marked by plurality and by confrontation, right? And how do we help this vision to advance? What do we have to say to this type of vision? What kind of market? What kind of state? And and here I was inspired when I studied her by Simone Weil, this philosopher who died at age 34 and had never published during his life more than a few articles, but then his own notes. And actually, this is a book called Taking Roots in English, right? And in that book, she tries to point to something that I think I find inspiring, and that would be that yes, it's the time you. Okay. So that she says that the problem with the people from 1789, so French Revolution, was to place this notion of rights at the center of the political constitution, and she wants to place the notion of need at the center, right? That's, of course, what the socialist state also wants to do, but Simone Weil defends the private property as a human need. She says human needs are to be at the center of our constitution, at the center of our living together, and human needs are something that, for her, are defined in kind of a balancing way, because how to distinguish human need from a human desire or whim? And for her, desire or whim cannot have a limit. You can desire the moon, and this is good that you do so. But the human need always has a balance, because you cannot eat and you would die if you wouldn't stop eating, right? So every true, genuine human need, it follows the model of hunger, she says. And when you do that, then you find that for property, for example, she talks about the human need to private property. And I would disagree, Edmund, that we don't have private property. We don't have it individually, but we have private property. When the ruler gave to the monks this land, it must have been huge for 30 villages to be there, right? But it belonged to them. So the monks could say, no, you don't belong here, or they could. So they, of course, and we have the private property. There is a joke among Benedictines that say that the European Benedictines, somebody says, oh, I need a pen. And then the monk answers, oh, we don't share our pens. And then comes an American abbot and says, okay, here is my pen, and you can have it, right? So we don't share our pens. It means that we have common property. We don't call it private. It is private because the other one is public, right? So a group that shares has a private property, and it can be collective, but of course, because a family has a collective property, right? So Simone Weil says private property is a human need, and by that she means private property of your home. So I don't know how that squares with the Kohausen or some of these projects. For her, this is a human need, your home, and a little bit of land. Some might think this is a bourgeois ideal, but I fully adhere to that. A little bit of land around it, so you can take a chair outside and get the sun, to have a place under the sun. And then she says the transportation, be it a bicycle or a horse or whatever you need to move. And also, if possible, as much as possible, the tools of your work, what allows you to work. But of course, she then develops a whole theory of cooperatives, that it would be her also contribution to how the economy could move in this direction. And also, I think I followed sometimes a little bit this economist in the US called Richard Wolff, when he talks about there is no possibility of a political democracy without economic democracy. But by that, he doesn't mean little groups that do it, but the whole economy we have to become conscious that how can we make sense or be serious with our political democracy if most of us go to work in a place where you stop being a decision maker for 8 hours a day. So you come to your working place and you find it normal that somebody else makes the decisions and that somebody else tells you what to do. And this is the vast majority of people. If they are lucky to have a job, right? In Spain, we still have, 20% of workless or arbeitslos, no? Unemployed. So, but those who work, they go to a place where this human basic dignity, which is to be a person that feels and thinks. We don't care about what you feel, we don't care about what you think, you leave it at home. And then you be here for 8 hours every day, all your working life, and then you go back and vote for somebody because we have a democracy. It's like a joke. It's impossible to have political democracy, not only because big corporations are capturing regulatory agencies, which is true, but because philosophically it is a contradiction that cannot sustain a true democracy, I would think, right? So this, as I say, I'm not saying that as I don't see a place for the commons, because from my youth, right, belonged to a group of ecologists, and we had a common project, and my friends continue having it, and I love it, and I'm invited many times to things that I feel it's a blessing to go to this place, to get to know these people, and they have bancos del tiempo, this is time banks, right, that people, what David was explaining. Each of one that I have met, they are a blessing, I think. And they are like a utopian reminder of what it is that we could be experiencing together, what kind of life. But then I am missing the link with, you mentioned a few, right? These legal hacks or these alternative laws that can be developed or this cooperation, right? But it still seemed to me that the model remained state and market, the evil guys that we don't deal with, and then these little good things, and we try to at least preserve a little place. But what I would, talk about is how do we really take seriously the idea that these little ones not only cannot thrive to what we would like, or I would like to see, right, to help really the poor, because these needs that I have mentioned from Simone Weil, it would mean what? That we are responsible for what? We are responsible for the needs of each other. And responsible to what level? Responsible to the level that we are able to fulfill them, right? So this questions private property in its sense of absolute right. So private property is a human need, but it's not, under Simone Weil, an absolute right. To be a human need is one thing. To be an absolute right is completely another one. We now have constitutions in all the liberal world where private property is at the same level than life. You have a right to life, well, or I would say even higher, more protected than life. But conceptually, it's at the same level. In the practice, it's more protected, the private property, because the people who own the most have the most means to protect. But conceptually, it's at the same level. So what do I mean by that very practically? If I own a whole room full of bread and you are dying from hunger outside my door, and that reminds us of a biblical parable, so sorry, but you don't have any obligation. The state cannot force you to give the bread. And if that person dying takes your bread, you put that person in jail. That's our law, right? How can we tolerate that? And how can we tolerate it? What kind of absurdity is this? The human needs being at the center of our Constitution, how would that look like? And I think because of the time, I stop here, but thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I think the three presentations together already formed a wonderful debate and raised lots of further questions and demand answers. Unfortunately, we have to end the live stream soon because it's a 90-minute live stream. We have the fortune that we can keep debating this tonight over wine and tomorrow and the day after. So before opening to the public for maybe one or two questions, I just want to pick from your presentations or from yours, Teresa, now just one question which yeah, I like the most at the moment, namely how to come into communion with those I have not chosen to be in communion with, and whether commoning at all attempts to provide an answer to that.
Well, I think commons tend to be voluntary unless you're in a geographic fixed position and it's your circumstance. But I think it's precisely that you have to come to terms with the plurality of a diverse community to make a common work. And the challenge is getting into a mind space of relationality as opposed to prisoner's dilemma. If I give this, will I get that? And thinking purely as an individual and developing this collective ethic. There was a term that we encountered from the Bantu of South Africa called Ubuntu, which is translated often as I am because we are. And it's about bringing into alignment the collective and the individual, and in a way dissolving that very binary. We in the West, in the capitalist West, tend to say individual and collective are opposites, but one can conceive them as being blended, and I think that's what the Commons attempts to do.
Okay, thank you. I would like to open it just for the reason that in a few minutes we need to close the debate in this room and then move to wine, but I hope you don't mind and we will continue this later. Are there any questions from the audience? Elise.
If nobody else has a question. So Teresa asked the question about, okay, is the Commonsverse just a small cherry on the cake? And is there a role for the state? Is there a role for the Constitution, if I understood you correctly, if we really want to make it something more than the cherry on the state? So I recently had the experience that I went to a movie about an anarchist watchmaking village in Switzerland. And I knew nothing about anarchy. I thought it basically meant chaos. So after watching this very interesting movie and seeing how property was communal and the people were extremely knowledgeable, people were well educated, and I was quite interested, so I went to Zentralverzeichnis Antiquarer Bücher. I ordered 10 books, and I read up on anarchism. And I read about anarchism also in Catalonia during the Spanish Civil War and how well it worked and everything. And then I understood that from one day to the other, as you correctly said, my first reaction was this is very similar to commoning, what I see here, anarchism, the way it was described in the places that it actually happened. And then I saw that basically the Spanish government in Madrid was able to destroy anarchism with two things. Basically, they killed a lot of people, but the second thing was that they actually cut off access to raw materials and to capital. So I think that Teresa is actually asking the key question.
People in the world whose everyday lives are dependent upon the commons, when you have open source software and Linux, which have upended the proprietary software industry worth billions of dollars, when you have the many other examples I cited, it's a very robust phenomenon. It's not always culturally legible or named as such, but the impact is very much there. The reason that it's more significant in my mind, I believe it's a seminal social force with potential political implications, and that it's precisely the failure of the state, which is so deeply allied with capital and large-scale markets, that it has failed to deal with the expense of the privatization of healthcare, the privatization of genes, the enormous costs of commercial academic journals. And yes, the state normally, under liberal political theory, is the one that steps in to police and assure accountability. It has failed. And we now have many years, decades, in which neoliberal capitalism has progressively captured government and not been as democratic a force. So I see the Commonsverse as a parallel polis, and I would add that Václav Havel said that when he was a cultural dissident, not when he was president, because he was precisely trying to think, I have a repressive, totalizing regime. What's the proper role for a person of goodwill and intelligence? And his idea was keep that spirit alive, develop those circuits of relationship, develop an alternative order. And I think that Hannah Arendt said that when people get together, as they come together, they become a political force, and when they go away, they're no longer a political force. I don't think the commons is primarily political because it's mostly about protecting what you love and defending it. And it's just when that gets enclosed, the word enclosure of the commons, when that happens, when it's privatized, commercialized, marketized, you're dispossessed from it, as you said with the anarchists. The anarchists were shut down because they didn't have access to that. The villagers of England were dispossessed and had to become paupers and wage slaves in Great Britain in Dickens's time because they didn't have access to their land commons and forests and pastures that they used to have. So this is really about reclaiming the shared wealth that we can use to meet our basic needs, both in the here and now without permission from lawyers or regulatory agencies or political parties that may or may not choose to advocate for it, as well as become a proto-political force, or at least meet your needs for survival. The commons have traditionally been a vehicle for survival, as we see in many global South countries or with mutual aid networks in responding to the pandemic. So I'm perhaps scattershooting a number of questions, but I hope I've answered some of the main concerns. But
Thank you. Teresa would like to comment.
Just because it's, I still see this difficulty because, for example, when you mentioned Wikipedia, right? I loved the idea, right? But the reality of Wikipedia, if I look for alternative medicine, it's not there. Wikipedia, I don't know who is doing that, but it is a way in which knowledge that you can call alternative medicine will be negativized in Wikipedia. So again, it's very easy when you mention Barcelona too, and I was politically active exactly with the so-called the Comuns, right, which is this group, and we wanted to make one thing together. But the truth is that market is staying the same. The interest at the beginning, it seemed it was going to be a possibility to challenge, but it has not been. So I speak also from this experience that has been one that maybe has looked better on the outside that for the people who live in Barcelona, and now recently has been the change again for very little but significant. So it is what happens when this hope that people have for a real alternative just gets not channeled, because I don't want to say that, but
neutralized.
Yes, that's
well, I mean,
thing,
I think
right?
that's my experience as a liberal. I've been disappointed that petitioning my government, believing in representative elections, has not produced the kind of change I hope for, or perhaps many people here. And so I think there's a lot of disappointment to go around, but I sort of wanted to think of strategies that might have some long-term strategic effectiveness.
And that would be then the thing is not to just pit one disappointment with another, but to say, don't we need both? But Edmund was saying both in the sense of the favor of the ruler and the initiative, but I don't mean the favor of the ruler, but I mean both a political strategy that takes into account a different vision of market and a different vision of state, and I would also not renounce to create these spaces, because as you say, many people, they are life-saving for many people.
Mm.
Okay, another question from Bertram Blumfeld.
Well, David, thanks. I appreciate very much your Commonsverse idea and the parallel Polis idea, but actually, I think even if you're saying hacking the law, you underestimate the law. That's perhaps a déformation professionnelle of mine, but actually I think that the law is crucial at this point, and private law especially, and not constitutional law so much, because I think the notion of property, the notion of contract, all this what you mentioned, which build up the market and make the relationships also to the state from the private persons up there, I think you could more conquer, you could more be saying, well, let's occupy the law and let's make a law of the commons, so to say, and then occupy the rest of the law. So could not be the commons more an experimental field of different legal forms? And because I hear a lot of anarchist, also empathy within the commonings, and I'm always suspicious of that. That's totally naive for me, to be honest. I think over... Yeah, no. I know. But over a certain scale, I think we need some institutional forms, and I think commons could be a perfect experimental sphere for conquering and evolving some new forms.
Well, I resonate to that. I say, show me your plan or blueprint. All I know is that in a lot of difficult political trenches, these have been hard-won, difficult, long struggles to get Creative Commons licenses, to get the general public license for software that allows it to be not taken private, to et cetera, et cetera. And so I welcome a more ambitious agenda, but we know how organized business forces are to prevent the law from changing. And so that's why, for now, I'm simply grateful for legal hacks. But of course, the longer-term project is to reimagine state law and law itself. And I think that vernacular law and customary law have their own legitimacy and power, especially as they manifest in some theatrical way. The Occupy movement totally changed the political terms and would potentially, if they had any institutional continuity or mechanisms, could have pushed through a lot. So I think the legal hacks have the potential as, well, a term I like is islands of coherence. And I came across a quote recently by a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry who said that islands of coherence have the potential in a world of chaos for changing into a new order, because it can change the dynamics. And so I think that small islands that show that an alternative works becomes both a moral indictment of the prevailing system as well as a staging area for a different kind of political approach.
We have one more question by Madhulika Banerjee, then an answer by you and brief end notes by YouTube, and then we have to continue the drinks. Thank you.
I just want to say it's more of a comment, but I hope that a comment that sort of links with the rest of the workshop as well. I really want to thank you, David, for, in a sense, what seems to me giving voice to so much that happens in the world and does not have a voice, does not have a presence, and therefore, for most people, does not exist.
That's precisely the issue.
Exactly. And what I feel very reassured by, coming from the Global South, trying desperately to say that, look, this is a world that exists where people live by these ideas, they survive because of these ideas, and yes, they are not the hegemonic frame of reference for either law of how the state should be run, how the market should function. True. However, I like this last phrase you use, islands of coherence, because they are islands of coherence if we know how to look for them. The difficulty is that they do not look coherent because we try to assess them by parameters that are completely alien to that context, but those are hegemonic parameters. And therefore, we believe that they are the most correct way or the analytically most powerful way in which to understand the systems by which they live. I'm just broadly calling them systems. And I think that it's very important for, and I'm grateful that you described yourself as both a practitioner and a scholar, because I think that it's high time that those of us who are scholars begin to see literally the worlds that actually exist and what they are saying to us. Mm-hmm. And all of scholarship does not need to derive itself from what is hegemonic, what has come down to us as received wisdom, but as wisdoms that exist on the ground. And I think that I welcome this workshop on commoning precisely for this idea, because it's so important that these islands of coherence can possibly have alternatives. So when you're talking about creating a different kind of polis, who knows the polis that we live in today and we are so upset about is the polis that has come after a lot of deliberation and thought and engagement and quarrels. So if we are to find a new polis, then we'll have to look for other ideas. And I think that this is a very important, and not resist it all the time and saying, this does not happen, this is not existing, this is not hegemonic, it's too powerful, come on, don't take it. I mean, it's important to challenge the powerful, and thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you for your comment. I appreciate it.
I think that was the perfect closing note, but I would still like to give the speakers the last word.
Sure. Well, I've been grateful for just to have this kind of conversation, because I find, frankly, much of my work is developing the horizontal connections and relationships of people I regard who see the commons. It's very difficult, even for my very close professional and personal friends who are, say, liberals or social democrats, who have a different worldview. They have this individualistic approach. They implicitly think that market-based solutions are the only legitimate or effective ones. They believe in some of the theoretical ideas of the government being receptive to ideas and being the engine for change. I think the history shows that so often the change comes from outside of those channels, and whether it's a spiritual tradition or a civil rights or feminist movement, I see the commons as dealing with some of the dysfunctional systems we have now that we are going to have to come to terms with if we're going to deal with climate change and the pathologies of economic growth. And that discussion has barely begun. Commons offers a way to, I think, help heal the social alienation of modernity by giving a sense of belonging, connection, responsibility, purpose. And I think it also helps get out of the consumerist trap, which is chewing up the earth in unsustainable ways. We need to find ways to cultivate an ethic of sufficiency, which the state and the market, frankly, are not interested in doing. They're too self-supporting in this vision of progress through growth. So I offer these ideas in that regard while fully acknowledging this is a very fragmentary experimental world that's emerging. And, but at the same time, what it has achieved has been remarkable in light of the neglect, lack of resources, or actual repression against it. So thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you. Edmund, would you like to add something?
Well, just very briefly, I think that the discussion we've just had makes me all the more eager for tomorrow's discussion as well, because I think we've seen the connection of these themes of the commons and of law, so I'm looking forward.
Teresa?
What I will also finish with another conflictive thing, I think, but it's all for the sake of continuing good discussion, which it came to mind listening to you now, David, and in the presentation. And again, because my heart comes here, right? So it's with myself that I am debating more than anybody else. But recently, that means yesterday, I read something coming from the WHO, the World Health Organization, saying that Tedros, the director, had convened a group of women, that's important, only women, economists and also from law, that are designing an agenda called One Health. And One Health is enough with this market economy, enough with an economy that is not to the service of the people. Now we are going to have worldwide the economy subject to the well-being of the people. That means subject to Tedros. That means subject to what is now becoming like a concentration of power in this particular agency with something called PHEIC, which is Public Health Emergency of International Concern. And there is a lawyer who used to be with the WHO called Sylvia Barron that is warning about that, right? So that's why I'm trying to conclude today with this call to the critical thinking, but not because I share any liberal market and I like it better, not because I don't believe that people are called to live together. I actually believe that I am not, I inter-am, right? That being is communion in itself. But this is now a very particular moment in history, and it's one where this genuine desire and need of the people, it could be just playing into some kind of this concrete agenda. No, I don't want to put agendas as strange ones, but this concrete one called One Health from the WHO.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Edmund. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you to the audience and also the viewers in the live stream. I very much look forward to continue critically thinking together tomorrow. And now, you are all invited to a glass of wine or a glass of water, and we can continue discussing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.